أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد الفاتح لما أغلق وخاتم لما سبق ناصر الحق بالحق والهادي إلى صراطك المستقيم وعلى آله حق قدره ومقداره العظيم. O Allah, we ask you to send your blessings upon our Master Muhammad, the opener of what was closed and the seal of what came before him, champion of the truth by the truth and guide to the straight path, and upon his family and companions, as is befitting his noble rank. Ameen. Allahumma ya Kareem akramna bi nur al-fahm wa akhrajna min dhulumat al-wahm wa la hawla wa la quwwata illa billah. O Allah, the noble, the generous, we ask you to ennoble us with the light of understanding and to remove us from the shadows of illusion, and there is no power nor might except through God. Ameen. Now that we are in this chapter on lifestyle, where really we're just talking about practical applications of our religion in like a day-to-day context. We're not talking about worship. We're talking about how to sort of do some of the more mundane worldly things as Muslims. And as we know, our religion provides guidance on all things, not just worship, but it is more of like the day-to-day, the things that we do, such as eating and meeting with family and things of this nature. And one of the things that was suggested that we talk about is how to deal with anxiety, depression, feelings of inadequacy, even despair as Muslims. And I thought that was a great idea because this is something that a lot of people deal with. And it's important not only that we acknowledge that so that our spaces, inshallah, can become equipped to work with people who are suffering from depression or anxiety or other forms of, mental distress that many of us go through, but also that, we as Muslims add our voice to this conversation, because while a lot of what I'm going to say tonight actually it's my own take, it's my own personal advice. We need to understand too that our religion is not one that I believe invalidates human feelings of grief, sadness, depression. In fact, I think that we can see even in the life of our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam that he dealt with these things. There was a year of his life that we call the year of sadness. And this wasn't like a minor form of sadness that he went through. No, he lost his wife. He lost the man who basically raised him, Abu Talib. His people were suffering from being starved, basically, by the Quraysh. He was nearly stoned to death in this year. And, we're going to get to this, but he made a dua after he was at Ta'if, which you may remember from our class on the Sirah, happened in the year of sadness. And it was really a low point for him. And he made a dua that is beautiful that we will actually recount tonight, inshallah. But that clearly comes from a place of profound sadness and just feeling of like incapacity, like not knowing where to go, what to do, who to turn to. So our Prophet, the greatest of creation, dealt with these things. So we need to understand that as Muslims, there should be no feeling that we have of not being allowed to experience things like depression, things like anxiety. We shouldn't think that this means that we are somehow abnormal or lacking in faith even, but that these things are entirely human. And as I believe, because of the world that we live in, I think probably you see cases of anxiety, cases of depression being far more pervasive nowadays. Like people who maybe in the past would not have been as susceptible to these things are susceptible to them today because of the world that we live in. So I'm very glad that you guys brought this up. I'm looking forward to talking about it. And I want to state from the beginning that I am going to be speaking about this first and foremost from personal experience. I think probably the first step in, like creating a permissive environment where these things can be discussed is actually being honest and vulnerable about our own experiences with them. And the truth is that I have experienced these things. I'm actually prone to these things. Are you guys familiar with the 4 temperaments? This is an idea from ancient medicine that every one of us has a temperament that sort of prevails within us. And that really what we ought to do to get to a place of health, and I think we would probably say mental health especially, is get to a place where the temperaments are balanced within us. But the 4 temperaments are melancholic, which is what I am, phlegmatic, choleric, and sanguine. And those mean, you can get into a lot of details on what those things mean. But depending on our temperament, we might be more or less prone to things like anxiety and depression. I'm melancholic, which means that it's not as bad as it sounds. Melancholic, you hear it and it's like, oh, so you're sad all the time. That's what that means. No, it's not what it means. But it means that I'm more introverted. Abu Bakr was a melancholic. Melancholics are usually introverted. They are usually more prone to be highly intellectual. Like they live up here. I don't mean like they're really smart, but they live up here, right? Their interior life is very rich. But the flip side of that is that their external, like social life, they aren't go-getters when it comes to those sorts of things. And so this is something that I know about myself. And this is actually part of how I have sort of come to terms in a healthy way with my own susceptibility to depression. I've dealt with this personally. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that tonight, inshallah. But because I have dealt with this, I actually, I'm not a doctor, I'm not that kind of doctor anyway. Although interestingly, I did get a doctorate. And they say that along with a death in the family and a divorce, getting a doctorate degree in any subject is about the most stressful thing that a person can go through in their lives. People who get PhDs while they're getting the PhD, have a higher rate of psychotic break than any other demographic of people in this country, because it's, as some of you may know, it is very, very intense. It's hard work, and it's work where really like you have to sort of turn inward, right? So anyway, all of that is to say, I'm speaking from a place of experience. I'm going to share some of what I have found works in dealing with this stuff, not just as a Muslim, but as a human being. I'm going to share what I have found works in actually dealing with this and getting yourself to a place where it does not pull you down into like the deepest, darkest pits of despair, but where you're actually, inshallah, resilient to it. But because I have experience with this, and because I am speaking from my own experience, you may find some of what I have to say to be unorthodox. It may contradict received medical advice. And so I want to say off the bat that If you are having suicidal thoughts of any sort, this class is not for you. This class is not meant to address your particular problem. You should seek the help of a professional and not take anything that I say to be something that could cure suicidal ideation. However, if you're anywhere below this, I think I have something to say which may be of value, inshallah. And so we're going to come back to this, but since this is a class on Islam, I'll say this up front before we come back to it, that I do believe there is a spiritual solution to depression. I believe prayer works, and I believe dhikr works. I believe salawat work in dealing with this, but it's not where you start. Like if you're actually in sort of a depressive state right now at this very moment, for me to tell you to well, just pray and it will get better. Just do some dhikr and you'll feel better. I know from personal experience that people who say that to you when you're really at a low point, you want nothing more than for them to go away. Because it's like, you can't possibly understand what I'm dealing with right now, or you wouldn't say that to me. Worship is a hopeful activity. It's something that we do from a place of profound hope. And when you are depressed, you're not feeling very hopeful. So I really see the spiritual solutions as being like those long-term things that we engage in that keep us from sinking to the very bottoms of depression, right? I do believe that works. But if you're in the middle of it, that ought not be where you start. I think we have to start with something that is far more attainable. And so what I want to share with you, this is actually something that I've probably been working out for myself over about 20 years. This is what I do when I fall into a state of depression. This is how I get myself back on my feet. And so your mileage with this may vary. And really, if you don't want to be depressed, just have kids because they're endlessly entertaining. The standard of what works is literally what works for you. So I hope you will feel entirely free to take or leave as much of this as sounds applicable to your situation. Although I think this is very general advice that can work for a lot of people. Certainly it has worked for myself, and through talking to other people, I've seen it work for others. So let's pretend, and maybe we don't have to pretend, some of us, but let's pretend that you're depressed right now. What is my advice to you? First thing you should do is get up. Literally get up. And this is like, okay, this sounds pretty basic. Yeah, well, it's hard to do basic things when you're depressed, right? Get up and put your shoes on and go outside. And during the daytime, go outside during the daytime and take a brisk walk for 15 minutes. It's November in Chicago and it's 28 degrees. I don't care. Get up and go out for a brisk walk in the 28-degree weather. The cold will actually do some good for you. The cold, we're going to talk about cold. Cold is part of my solution, in fact. So it's actually good that it's 28 degrees outside. Go for a brisk walk and don't wear sunglasses. Don't wear sunglasses. We're here for some vitamin D. We're here to elevate our heart rate just a little bit, and we're here to get some vitamin D. Now, again, even if it's cold outside, I want to suggest that you do this. Find a sunny spot. Find a sunny spot, and it's like, okay, well, it's winter in Chicago. We may not see the sun for another 3 weeks before the clouds part. You know, work with what you can. But remove as many articles of clothing as you can and expose yourself to the sun for about 5 minutes. Okay. Now, go home, right? Make yourself a nutritious meal. Make yourself a nutritious meal. Don't microwave a Hot Pocket, please. In fact, if you want to get to a place of better mental health, one of the first things that you can start doing is taking care of your physical health. I promise you it's all linked. It's all linked. But make yourself a nutritious meal. And then before you go to bed that night, you guys are going to hate me. You're going to hate me for this. Take a cold shower. Take a cold shower. All right, there's 3 reasons for this, why we take a cold shower. First, you will get deeper sleep. A cold shower before bed causes you to have deeper sleep. Sleep is when your body repairs itself, not just like your muscles, right? Those repair themselves too. But your neurons repair themselves during deep sleep as well. And so you want to get the deepest sleep you possibly can, and a cold shower will help with that. The second reason you want to take a cold shower is that one of the reasons that we get depressed is that we become unable to deal with stress in our lives. And the way that you become better at dealing with stress is you actually, on a regimented basis that you can control, you deal with positive forms of stress. And what I mean by a positive form of stress is a form of stress that is relatively short in duration. It has an end point, and you actually have a feeling of overcoming it at the end. So like that cold shower, I promise you it's not going to last long. You won't be in there for 15 minutes. You'll be in there for 5 at the most. A 5-minute cold shower feels like a half-hour warm shower, I promise. But that is a positive form of stress that you are putting on your body. And because you are overcoming that stress, your body is basically telling your mind that it is possible to overcome stress. It's possible to deal with it. It's possible to have a beginning and an end to it. And so much of what we deal with today is just kind of this prolonged, indefinite stress that is like low level, but it's always burning in the back of your mind. And you never get to the end of it. And so it just kind of slowly wears on you. I think whether or not you get depressed, certainly you deal with this. And cold showers can help even with that. And then finally, the third thing that you get out of a cold shower is you will feel something. It's not going to be a good feeling, but if you've ever been depressed, you know that part of what makes it so bleak is that you don't feel anything. And sometimes it's like I would pay just to feel a negative emotion right now. But I've gone weeks and I haven't felt anything at all whatsoever. You know, it's really as if like the color just sort of like drains from the world. But you will feel something when you take a cold shower. And that has a way of kind of like jolting you out of the state of depression. That's the first day. That's just what I want you to do on the first day. Take a brisk walk, expose yourself to sunlight, eat a good meal, and take a cold shower before you go to bed, and then get 8 hours of sleep. Make sure that you're getting 8 hours of sleep. Do this for 2 weeks and see how you feel. Like really, if you just did that for 2 weeks, I think what you would find is that you start to improve significantly. Now, there are longer term things that I would like to suggest as well, but really they're just variations on everything that I just suggested to you. And I know this is a class on Islam, But really, I think much of our depression nowadays stems from our physical states. It's not just that like there's some chemical imbalance that goes off in our heads and it is completely disconnected from everything else about us. No, that chemical imbalance happens for a reason. It's in response to something. And really, it comes down to our relationships with our bodies, which for most of us are pretty bad. We have not learned how to take care of our bodies in this society, in this culture. It's not something that we're good at. Our bodies are not something that we are in touch with, generally speaking. And the Prophet ﷺ said that our bodies have rights over us. So doing these things are really a way of giving your body what it needs, giving it its due. Now, longer term, what should you do? And look, there are a lot of things that you can do. So which is why I'm saying, like, find what works for you. Find what works for you. But these are general things that will work for most people, I believe. You want to start supplementing zinc, B vitamins, and omega-3 fatty acids. Now, if you are a vegetarian, I would suggest actually supplementing these with like stuff that you get at like the vitamin shop or GNC. If you are not a vegetarian, what I would recommend to you is eating beef liver once a week. I don't care if you like it. Eat beef liver once a week, and it has all of that in it and more. Beef liver is like a miracle food if you don't know anything about it. It has almost every vitamin your body needs. It has a ton of protein, obviously, but it has minerals. It has, you know, it is like a multivitamin. So if you're not a vegetarian, I would actually recommend doing that. And if you have always hated liver, you can ask me for a recipe. I think my recipe is pretty good. You're welcome to have it. Then get to a point where you're doing 30 minutes of cardio per day. There have been studies that show that a majority of cases of depression can be cured with 30 minutes of cardio per day alone by itself. And the way that you want to do this cardio is, you guys know that it's not like a gym. You know Orange Theory? You guys, do you know what the Orange Theory is? Yeah, yeah, they're cardio exercises. What is the orange in Orange Theory? Does anyone know? It's your heart rate. Yeah, so there's like a color-coded way of like measuring heart rate. When you're in the red, you're like exerting yourself to like the utmost. You can't do anymore. And you can't stay in the red zone for a very long time. You'll exhaust yourself or you'll pass out, right? Orange is just below that. It's intense cardio activity, but that you can actually sustain for a 20 to 30 minute period of time. That's what you want to do. That's where you want your heart rate to be. And that will do a lot for you. That will do a lot for you. Even better is if you can lift weights because of that positive stress that, you know, for 30 minutes or an hour, if, you know, you're lifting weights, you are putting your body under significant stress, but you're going to, you know that you will complete it after a set period of time. And you will feel good at the end of it. Like, you guys know like these like marathon runners. You know, people are like crazy about running. They love to run. And it's because like, you know, at like mile 20 or so in a marathon, this sense of euphoria just overtakes them, right? That it actually feels good to just keep running. Now that is a response to positive stress that they are putting their body under. But our body has really, maybe you're sensing a trend here. I haven't mentioned antidepressants yet. But our body has the ability to really supply what you need to overcome depressive states, I believe. And this is where maybe it gets a little bit unorthodox. But we really, by modulating and controlling the positive stresses that we expose ourselves to, like cardio, like lifting weights, like exposure to cold, we can actually get those imbalances worked out for ourselves. And then I would suggest cold showers 3 times a week. There's a lot of other benefits to cold showers, by the way, a ton of benefits. I won't go into all of them. You can ask me in the Q&A if you want. But then also get regular sleep. Get 8 hours of sleep per night. I'm still bad at this, but I try, I try. And then try that for a month and see how you feel. Now, to get even more unorthodox, I would suggest also seeing a naturopathic doctor. See a doctor. Do you guys know about Islamic medicine? Do you guys know about like these people called Hakims? They're healers. They're like traditional healers who practice prophetic medicine. And there's some like right here in the Chicago area. I can actually make some referrals if anyone is interested to some of these doctors here in the Chicago area. MashaAllah. It's just a wide world, there's so much to see and touch in it. And this is where I'll get a little bit personal. So I was dealing with a severe bout of depression starting about a year ago. I remember it started right after our newcomers retreat last year, which was in November. And it just progressively got worse through December. And I was at home with my wife and kids, visiting my family down in Georgia. And I was just like sleeping all day. I wasn't hanging out with my family. My wife was mad at me because I was like, just leaving her with the kids all day. And by the time we got back to Chicago, early January, she was like, I'm scheduling you an appointment with this naturopathic doctor that I've been seeing, and you were going, and I don't really want to hear anything about it. And I said, okay, fine, I will go. I will see him. And this will sound crazy, but I walked into his office at the absolute lowest point of depression I've ever experienced in my life. And I walked out no longer depressed. It was an hour-and-a-half session that I had with him. Now, what I walked out with is what I would call a depression hangover, right? Where I literally like no longer felt depressed, but I was kind of like in this fog, like, whoa, what did I just come out of? For those of you who may have been hungover at some point in your lives, it's actually a very good analogy. It's like you're no longer drunk, but you don't feel great either, but you're no longer intoxicated. It was like that. We have healers in our community who are capable of doing these things, and they do them in very non-invasive ways that do not require severe and heavy forms of medication. And it's really quite amazing. We can talk more about how that works, why that works, if you're curious about that in the Q&A, but I really just want to inform you that this is an option. And it was not an option that I knew existed until very, very recently. And frankly, I think it is a crime that more people do not know about this. These types of doctors are really, really amazing. And part of what they do is, they do not just treat symptoms. They treat root causes of all kinds of physical and mental illness. So I can say more about that. And that may sound a little bit unorthodox. It may sound a little bit unlike anything that you have heard about this topic in the past. And you may have heard me express some skepticism to the form of medicine that is prevalent in this country in previous classes. I have expressed that. Well, you know, what I want to point out is that just last week, there was an article that came out in the New York Times saying that, you know, new research, which really went back and evaluated old research as part of its study, now suggests that antidepressants, and I swear to God, like, please do not take me to task for this. Please, you know, take your own health into your own hands and, you know, do what is best for you. But also, please do not blindly accept whatever the current medical consensus of the day is, because medical consensus is changing all of the time. This new study suggests that antidepressants do not work by fixing a chemical imbalance in your mind. They do not work by fixing a chemical imbalance. Rather, that they do work, but because of the placebo effect. That there's just been a profound placebo effect that has led to people who have been on antidepressants experiencing relief from their depression. And you take that along with a lot of the very serious side effects of antidepressants, and it might be wise to at least consider alternative methods, right? That is all I will suggest to you. So do your own research on these things. And if you want a link to that New York Times article, I'd be happy to supply it to you. Okay, so that is the physical dimension. And I think, you know, like I said, our physical bodies are very much connected to our mind. So you work on the body, you will have a profound effect on the mind. But there is a psychological dimension to this that is very much worth addressing. And really, this is the fact that, like, there are things in your life that trigger your depression, things that trigger your anxiety. And we're not by default good at recognizing those triggers. I think, like, usually we get like really far down the road of a state of depression or any state of agitation before we even realize that we are in that state. Quite often, like, it sneaks up on us, right? And at that point, we kind of have to like retrace our steps if we even care to think about what triggered it. We really have to retrace our steps for like quite a while to say, yeah, it was that thing 4 days ago that happened. That's really what sent me on a downward spiral, right? But there are things that trigger these states, and you need to be able to identify them. And only you can do that for yourself. I can't really tell you how to do that. But what I will say is that usually 9 times out of 10, what I have found is that they are the things that prevent you from doing the things that I mentioned above, which help cure depression. They're the things that keep you from eating healthily, things that keep you from having positive forms of stress through physical activity or physical experiences, and things that help you from having forms of like rejuvenation, like good sleep. And a lot of this just simply goes back to the fact that, like, we live sedentary lives. And usually when we are in that sedentary state and some form of stress, negative stress hits us, we are not prepared to deal with that. And that kind of sends us on that spiral. But if you can identify those things, you can actually, just through sheerly recognizing it, keep yourself from spiraling. You can say, okay, you know what? This is pushing me in a bad direction. I'm going to take 15 minutes. I'm going to step away from the situation. I'm going to catch my breath. I'm going to go outside for a walk. I'm going to have a good meal. You know what? I'm going to sleep on this. You do the things that can pull you out of the depths of depression when you're in like the early shallow stages, and that can help you from descending as far as you would have. otherwise. Now, because a lot of this is external, this is something I have observed about myself, and I've observed it in other people, is that a lot of our depression and a lot of our anxiety is actually social in nature, even political and economic in nature, which is to say that it doesn't just have to do with things that are going on like up here in our minds. It has a lot to do with external factors that we are dealing with. Right? External factors have a way of triggering these events that send us into these states that are unhealthy for us. And so I think we have to realize that a lot of what goes on in here and a lot of what goes on in here is a product of what's going on out here. Right? So when we can identify that, we can actually be more scrupulous in exerting some kind of control over our environment. And at the very least, exerting some control over how we react to our environment. You know, I think we probably live in a time where people are increasingly feeling powerless over their own destinies. Right? I remember, this may sound crazy. I remember, as a kid, that people my age, as like a teenager, talked far more about their hopes and aspirations for the future. Like, what do you want to be when you grow up? What type of life do you want to live when you grow up? When I talk to teenagers and younger kids, even nowadays, they aren't interested in that type of conversation to the same extent. And I think that that is a product of something that we all deal with, which is a sense of powerlessness over our own ability to navigate our lives on our own terms. Now, do you think that's not going to have an effect on your mental health? Right? My point here is, do not assume that your mental health is like this isolated individual thing that you alone are going through by yourself, that is disconnected from what every other person in this world and in the society is going through. Everyone is dealing with it on some level. How we react to it is what we have control over, right? And this is also important to say, because you're not necessarily unhealthy because you are depressed, because you're anxious. You actually might be having quite a natural reaction to an environment that is completely sick. So don't internalize it. Don't say, well, this is something that is wrong with me. This is something that is my fault, which is different from taking responsibility. But saying, I am to blame for this, puts a lot more weight on your shoulders, and ultimately will probably send you into a state of greater depression than if you recognize that, like, hey, this is just a normal reaction. This is actually a healthy reaction. I won't say healthy because it's a state of unhealth, but it is a natural reaction to an unhealthy environment. So realize that, and that actually will enable you, I think, to start taking some control over how you react to these things. Now, we do have to take control over how we react to these things. I think ultimately, we are responsible. Like, no one else can help you with your depression if you don't help yourself. No one else can cure your anxiety if you don't try to cure it yourself, right? We have ultimate responsibility for these things, but we have to recognize where they originate from, right? And this gets us to the spiritual dimension. And this is where, okay, it kind of connects back to a class on Islam. It's not just like Will's like personal advice on his highly specific personal advice on how to deal with depression. Like, oh, supplement zinc? I didn't expect to hear that in being Muslim. Jazakallah khair. And B vitamins. Yeah, B12 especially, but B vitamins. And again, if you're not a vegetarian, eat liver and you will get all of your B vitamins. Yeah. The spiritual dimension. So probably one of the greatest lessons that we have from the Quran about what we are talking about tonight is the story of Jonah. You guys know Jonah? Jonah and the whale? Yeah. Here's what Allah has to say about this story that many of us probably know first from the Bible. This is in Surah Al-Anbiya, chapter 21 of the Quran. He says, and mention Jonah when he went off in anger and thought that we would not decree anything upon him. And he called out within the darkness, there is no deity except you, exalted are you. Indeed, I have been a wrongdoer. So we responded to him and saved him from his distress. And thus do we save the believers. Now, I mean, this is sort of like the interesting thing about the Quran. Oftentimes when Allah tells these stories, he's assuming that his audience is already like very familiar with this story, because many of the people in Arabia at this time were Jews or Christians, and even the polytheists were familiar with the stories of Jews and Christians. So there's a lot that is sort of like assumed that you know here. But the story of Jonah, if you're not familiar with it, is Jonah was a prophet that God sent to the city of Nineveh. He sent him to the city of Nineveh. And Jonah, because he was sort of looking at this sick environment, right? He was saying, I don't want to preach to these people. I don't want to call these people to Allah because this environment is so sick. I'm going to flee. I'm going to do other than what God is calling me to do. I'm going to flee. And so he gets on a boat and he starts fleeing the city of Nineveh, and a storm overtakes them as they are on this boat. And Jonah is thrown overboard and he is swallowed up by this whale, or like a big fish. Probably it was a whale. And this is another interesting thing about the Quran. Sometimes we get more than what we get in the Bible. We get Jonah's prayer to God. He says, La ilaha illa ant subhanaka inni kuntu mina dhalimin. Says, there is no God but you. Glory be to you. Indeed, I was one of the wrongdoers, or literally, I was one of the oppressors. Now, I think this is very interesting because Jonah had a negative response to his sick environment. And because he had a negative response, he was thrown into a place of profound darkness. And the way that he ultimately escaped that darkness was by taking personal responsibility. He acknowledged his own culpability. And this is why I say the spiritual solution has to come, later, like after you get out of like the darkest part of your depression. Because if I just say to you, hey, I see that you're depressed, you probably need to take some responsibility for your situation. You're not going to listen to anything that I have to say to you, right? But ultimately, this is what God is telling us here. Ultimately, it is by taking responsibility for our reaction to a negative environment that surrounds us that we get relieved from that place of darkness. He says, Inni kuntu mina dhalimin. Indeed, I was one of the oppressors. If nothing else, he oppressed himself by leaving something that God was calling him to. Right? So we have to take responsibility for these things. And when we do, God says, so we responded to him and saved him from his distress. And thus do we save the believers. That when, this is like everything in our religion. God tells us, like, when you take one step towards him, he takes 10 towards you. When you come to him walking, he comes to you running. You have that moment of tawbah, of repentance, of literally just turning away from that thing that was holding you back and saying, you know what, I will do what I can to remove myself from the situation. That's the moment where God grabs you and pulls you straight out of it. Right? And this is absolutely true. This is absolutely true in terms of a spiritual solution to depression, to anxiety, to despair, to any sort of negative state that we might go through. That when we get to a point, and I'm not suggesting this is the first point of helping ourselves, but when we get to the point where we say, I am going to, let's say, start to identify those triggers that set me on a downward spiral. I will do something to save myself from this situation. And I will do so with the hope and the sincere belief that in doing this, God will do most of the work in pulling me out of the state that I'm in, that God absolutely pulls you out of that state. And again, like I said, the measure of all of this is your own personal experience. It's what actually makes you feel better. But what I'm saying is try it and see how it works. I guarantee you that it will work. I guarantee you that, despite my dispositions, despite the things that I'm actually inclined to, if I were not a person that prayed, my depression would have been much worse. It would have been much worse. I know that for a fact. And really, when it comes to, how our spiritual life links up with all of this, la ilaha illallah, which is what Jonah says. He says, la ilaha illa ant. There's no God but you. He's talking directly to God. But this is a powerful statement. When said with actual presence, with actual awareness of what it is that you're saying, this is a powerful statement. That this dunya, this world, ultimately is something that you can overcome. Ultimately, it is not something that you need to fear. Ultimately, it is not something that has to overpower you, that has to overwhelm you. That ultimately only God can do those things. Ultimately, you really only ought to fear God. Because God can put you in any state that he wants. The Shahada is a liberatory statement in this way. When we actually say it while recognizing the truth of this statement, it will free you from things that overpower you. It will free you from things that overpower you, because nothing is greater than God. That's why we say Allahu Akbar. Nothing is greater than God. And when you believe that, that is a reality that you can live within. And that is something that will absolutely keep you from sinking into really, really dark places where you actually reach points of despair. This is something that we can actually save ourselves from. And this is the whole of the prophetic tradition. You look at every single prophet, alayhim salam, that was mentioned in the Quran. What do? They are going into unhealthy environments and they are calling people to something that is beyond this world, that is beyond the oppressive nature of what they are dealing with in Mecca in the 7th century, or in Nineveh, I forget when Jonah lived, or with Ibrahim's people, or any of the prophets. This is the one thing that unites them. They go into sick places. They go to places that will make the average person sick, and they call people to something that allows them to rise above that sickness. And so this is why prayer works. This is why dhikr works, right? These things actually work. And again, I'm not asking you to take my word for it. I'm asking you to try it, right? Try it out. See how it goes for you. Tawheed is the ultimate form of health. It's really the ultimate form of health. Now, we do have, prayer is great, like dhikr is great. We have like specific du'as that we can use to deal with these things as well. And one in particular, I've already given you one. That is Jonah's du'a. La ilaha illa ant subhanaka inni kuntu mina dhalimin. This is in Surah Al-Anbiya, verse 87, if you want to go look it up. La ilaha illa ant subhanaka inni kuntu mina dhalimin. The Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam made a dua where he asked God to avert anxiety and depression. Right? So let's hear that dua. I'll read it in English first. He says, "O Allah, I seek refuge in you from grief and sadness, from weakness and from laziness, from miserliness and from cowardice, from being overcome by debt and overpowered by others. Allahumma inni a'udhu bika min al-hammi wal-huzn, wal-ajzi wal-kasal, wal-bukhli wal-juban, wa-dala'i al-din, wa-ghalibat al-rijal." And again, I can share these du'as with you guys, like if you want to try to memorize them. These are good things to memorize so that, like when you actually feel these triggers taking place, these are good things to say. These are really good things to say. And then finally, I want to share the Prophet's dua. This was his dua at Ta'if. So I mentioned this already, but this took place in the year of sadness. And this took place after his wife Khadija had died, after his uncle Abu Talib had died, while his people were starving because the Quraysh were boycotting them. And he thought to himself, perhaps I've done all I can do in Mecca. Let me go to this town. It's on the outskirts of Mecca. It's called Ta'if. Perhaps they will be receptive to my message. And when he arrives, he finds that the people of Ta'if heard that he was coming, and they instructed their children to pelt him with stones when he arrived into town. And he got hit with so many stones that he was bleeding from his face so profusely that his blood was pooling in his sandals. So he's badly injured. And he's run out of Ta'if. He can't stay there. So you imagine what his state is like at this moment. I'm not going to sit here and try to diagnose the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but this was a moment clearly of profound sadness, clearly a profound anxiety for him. It was a low point. And this is what he said to God. And I think you'll probably notice a theme with the dua of Jonah here. He says, "To you, my Lord, I complain of my weakness, lack of support, and the humiliation I am made to receive. O most merciful of those who give mercy, you are the Lord of the weak, and you are my Lord. To whom do you leave me? To a distant person who receives me with hostility, or to an enemy you have given power over me? As long as you are not displeased with me, I do not care what I face. I would, however, be much happier with your mercy. I seek refuge in the light of your face, by which all darkness is dispelled, and both this life and the life to come are put in their right course against incurring your wrath, or being subject to your anger. To you I submit until I earn your pleasure. Everything is powerless without your support." And so, in many ways, this is perhaps a more appropriate dua when we are facing some form of like external oppression. But the thing that is interesting about it is that external oppression that he was facing caused a state of intense sadness within him. And the first thing he did in this dua is exactly what Jonah did in his dua. So he took personal responsibility, though he had done absolutely nothing. He begins with what we call adab, etiquette towards God. He says, to you, I complain of my weakness, right? My lack of support, the humiliation I must face from other people, right? Personal responsibility. Even if, even if you're being oppressed and you have absolutely no hand in the oppression that you're suffering, it's completely beyond your control. This is a profound lesson, because the way that we pull ourselves out of these states is not by continuing to tell ourselves that we are powerless against them. No, we say, you know what? I'm the one who has a shortcoming, because when you admit that you have a shortcoming, you're also admitting that you have the capacity to do better and to overcome. Right? It may not make sense on the face of it, but when you think about it, when you admit culpability, you are saying, I actually can do better than this. I have the strength, I have the ability to determine a different outcome for myself. And then he goes to complain to God. We are absolutely 100% allowed to complain to our Creator. In fact, this is one of the characteristics of the awliya, of the saints, is that you will not ever hear them complain to a human being, but they absolutely complain to God. They absolutely will complain to God. So this is something that we are allowed to do. And we need to understand this, that when it comes to speaking with God, we don't have to hold back. We don't have to put up, a front. We don't have to show a strong face. God already knows what we're going through, right? So this too is actually considered good etiquette with God. Complain to him about what is afflicting you. And, he says, look, as long as I have you, as long as I have you, la ilaha illallah, as long as I have you, then I don't really care about the sickness that surrounds me, right? I will deal with it, but I would much prefer if you would deal with me on the basis of your mercy. Don't try me. Like, please do not put me to trials. Deal with me on the basis of mercy, right? So you can make this dua, you can make your own dua that is like it, that has, a similar form of like fulfilling those etiquettes with God. And you can believe that by making that step, God will reach right down and pull you out of whatever you're in. That's a reality. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلى الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. آمين.